Back in the 50s, people in this country really didn't know what the world outside Europe looked like. Images from Singapore or Bangkok or Bali or Timbuktu were like the other side of the moon. 50 years ago, I was a young television producer in charge of what the BBC then rather grandly called its Travel and Exploration Unit. Actually, what it consisted of was me and one other person, and we took film from travellers, essentially amateur film, from distant parts of the world. Every now and again, we commissioned a film, and a group of undergraduates from Oxford and Cambridge turned up in the office and said they were proposing to drive from London to Singapore. They sounded as though they knew what they were talking about, and I thought we'd take a risk and give them some film.
This programme uses that footage never before shown in colour to reconstruct a journey through a lost world. Wars and revolutions have made the voyage impossible today.
It was a feeling of high adventure. We hadn't the faintest idea what we were going to do.
We didn't like the way they carried their weapons, and at one stage I think Tim and or Nigel sort of took over the weapons from them.
It certainly was a challenge that we hadn't anticipated. You know, we were very sort of probably overconfident, almost to the point of arrogance.
Early in 1955, 6 young men formed an expedition team. Each was assigned a specific role.
Any expedition needs to build a team. It's not at all satisfactory to have a group of friends. So the recruitment was done on the basis of various tasks that people needed to do. They needed a cameraman and photographer, and so they asked me to recommend somebody. So honestly, I chose myself.
As a geographer, I knew about maps, and therefore I suppose I brought the navigational skills along.
I fancied myself as a bit of a writer, though I really hadn't got much experience. But I had done my national service in the Far East and knew a bit about those parts. So we were a sort of polyglot bunch. I think 4 out of the 6 of us had done our national service. We weren't in any way qualified. I don't know how one would qualify anyway, but the arrogance of youth, we reckoned we could do it. We reckoned we could do it if anybody could do it.
The team proposed to drive nearly 18,000 miles from London to Singapore. This had never been done before.
The main problem was people had driven from London to Calcutta, no problem at all. In fact, the record at the time was 2 weeks. Others had tried to go further but had failed. The reason they'd failed is that there was really no way through Burma. Before the war, there had been no roads. 2 military roads were built during the war, and it was generally accepted that they had lapsed back into the jungle.
For any chance of success, the expedition needed a vehicle which could last the distance over difficult terrain. There was only one contender.
We went to the Rover Company and we said, look, how about a couple of Land Rovers? And amazingly, they came through. And once we had the BBC and the Land Rovers, then all kinds of other sponsors came in. We had 83, I think, sponsors, ranging from the Land Rovers to the makers of whiskey. We'd put 6 to 8 months' work into the gestation of the thing, and now I suppose if there was a moment of birth, it was actually going aboard the aircraft at Lymm Airfield in Kent.
On September the 1st, 1955, the team began the first leg of their historic journey. Back then, the easiest way to get the vehicles across the channel was by air.
There was some excitement, we felt at last we are really on our way, we're no longer just talking about it. This is it, this was a sort of moment of truth, and as the aircraft lifted off and one saw the fields of England sort of disappearing under the wing and then the channel, yes, it was a moment of mild excitement, I think.
It was a feeling of high adventure. We hadn't the faintest idea what we were going to do. We were a group of people who didn't really know each other. Even in the preparation period, we had each had a separate task, so that we'd only sort of come together on the runway, more or less.
As part of the sponsorship deal, the team had to promote their trip to the foreign media.
When we got to Paris, the French television say, we want you to do something typically English. How about brewing up tea? So we said, all right, we'll brew up tea if that's what you think English people do all day. We decided it should be done on the bottom of the Eiffel Tower, so we impressed ourselves and everybody else and baffled the spectators by brewing up tea in our billy can.
The overland route to Asia meant passing through the Balkans.
We had to go through Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, but not Iron Curtain. And so we were a bit dubious about whether we would have any political trouble.
I think I was the only smoker, and I was given quite a lot of cigarettes by one or other of the manufacturers. The cigarettes were very useful to give to border guards and people who, just might be able to ease our passage a little bit. We drove down this newish autobahn from the north of Yugoslavia down to Belgrade, and we might have passed 20 vehicles in 200-300 miles.
And all the children on the roads were waving to us. BB, I think, said, we must wave back and bring fraternal greetings from Cambridge to the People's Republic of Yugoslavia. So we duly waved back.
The Land Rovers drove through Greece and into Turkey until they reached Istanbul, the gateway to the east.
In the 50s, places like Middle East and beyond seemed as remote as remote. Now, of course, it's rather different, because now package holidays will take you all over the place. But then, when you got the idea that someone who you might have known, who might have lived next door, could have driven there, that seemed absolutely amazing.
We had 2 new rules when we crossed the Bosphorus. One was no lettuce beyond the Bosphorus, and the other one was, if you've got nothing to do, boil water. Lettuce, being uncooked, was frequently fertilized by human body fluids, shall we say. So we thought it would be extremely imprudent to consume them. The Bosphorus is, as it might be, the Rubicon. Once we left Europe and got into Asia, this was the beginning, and it was full speed ahead.
Once we got into Turkey, the roads began to, on the whole, be not so good, and the distances got to be greater, and the countryside got to be more open and more arid.
And then going through southern Turkey, you realize you were in a different world completely. And then you get round to Syria, and it's definitely very, very different indeed.
There was a bit of a joke within the six of us that we were quite frequently saying, well, this is the last meal before we leave civilization. But I mean, there's blatantly incorrect. I mean, you know, we in some ways we were moving into civilization when one goes into the Middle East. We were diverting, of course, to go and see sites and film different places along the way, Crusader castles, Baalbek, many, many other things of that kind. So we had a program sort of which we were stitching together to enhance the film that we were making for the BBC.
The simple practicalities of travel were a constant preoccupation.
One's concerns were immediate. How far is it to the next place? What's the fuel situation? We've got enough water. Let's find a decent campsite for the night. Rather than, as one might wish, these sort of broadly philosophic, which really didn't concern us too much. When we're in the countryside, when we're out on the desert or near desert, we would camp just by the side of the road. And it was cold. I remember it was quite cold at night.
My job as cook was to make the soup and make the breakfast, and I had to get up first. I slept in the Land Rover rather than on the ground in camp beds. I got up usually about 5:30. We wanted to start early because the heat of the day is very great. So I would get out of bed, light the petrol stoves, and brew up large quantities of water for the day, from which we made tea, and the porridge.
Always had porridge. BB always made porridge.
And the big advantage of porridge is it's quite filling, it's easy to make, and you can get compressed oats in a tin, which sort of fluffs up. A small tin lasts many days. And although you can see sometimes on the film people eating with some disgust at the porridge, the consequence of that will be, well, you can get up early and you can make the porridge, or you can make something else.
The team headed for Beirut, which was then the Middle East's most glamorous resort.
We thought of Beirut as being the Paris of the Middle East. We understood that they spoke French, and that they had a nice veneer of French culture. They had a lovely climate, and we arrived there, would have been late September, I think, yes. And we learned to water ski there from the Saint-Georges Hotel, which was the well-known hotel.
Some of us water skied, but only Adrian had ever done any. We stayed a night in a girls' school. Unfortunately, the girls were away on holiday.
Beirut was our first sort of really relaxation point. Very sophisticated people and a bit of flesh pots, really, which when one thinks about Beirut, everything that Beirut's been through since seems extraordinary, because, you know, the place has been the scene of civil turmoil. And But to us, Beirut was a marvellous place.
3 years later, Beirut erupted into a bloody civil war that would wreck the region for decades. The next major challenge was to cross the 400-mile stretch of desert to Iraq, at this time still a monarchy on good terms with Britain.
The journey from Damascus in Syria to Baghdad, and it's always been a bit of a barrier. I mean, going back to, biblical times, it used to take 4 and 5 weeks to get mail into, say, Baghdad. A couple of New Zealanders thought they could do better than that. They started a bus service. The problem was to get buses built which were rugged enough, so they built them themselves. And these became known as the Nan buses because the two brothers were the brothers Nan. Of course, it's long since disappeared now, but we deliberately spent 2 or 3 days in the workshop seeing these things being built, and then travelled overnight. They always went at night because it was cooler. Marvellously impressive to see the way the drivers, in the loom of the headlights, could, because there's no road, and they'd swerve around sand and rocks and this and that and the other, and then the dawn had come up and one was running into Baghdad.
On arriving in Baghdad, the team stocked up on valuable food supplies. 3 years later, the pro-British regime would be overthrown in a military coup. The expedition now crossed the border into Iran, where they had a meeting with the Iranian army. With Western support, the army had removed Iran's nationalist government just 2 years earlier.
Rovers were anxious to pull off a big deal with the Persian army, because in those days it was much more commonly called Persia rather than Iran. And we were asked to demonstrate our vehicles. So we went out to the army proving grounds and we chose various quite tough bits of terrain to drive over, and we ended up going up a very, very steep hill.
We found that we couldn't get up some of these steeper inclines in forward gear, but we could backwards, which amazed the spectators how versatile these vehicles were and how successful at going backwards. If you can't go forwards, you can always retreat.
The Iranian army was so impressed, it promptly ordered 500 Land Rovers.
Today, it may well be true that every stretch of the journey is better known than it was at the time. But in fact, I doubt it would be possible now to do that, because the world has divided itself against itself, and there are plenty of places now where you will not be allowed to cross the frontier. So this journey is both a wonderful journey in the sense that you are discovering the unknown, but it's also a journey which I don't think could be made again today, and certainly not in the gay, sort of happy-go-lucky cavalier spirit that these chaps did it in.
The team sped across Pakistan and picked up the Grand Trunk Road through India.
The Grand Trunk Road runs right through the north of what used to be of the subcontinent, from Peshawar right through to Calcutta. It's the link through the country. It's not as grand as you might think. The middle of it is tarmac, and they call it paka. And either side is gravel, and they call that kacha. And the tarmac is only sufficiently wide for one vehicle. So when you're coming towards each other, one or the other has to give way to move over to the left into the kacha, and it's a question of who moves first, you see. We did have some accidents. nothing very fatal. I hit a bullock cart, for instance, and that would have damaged the bullock cart, and to get that repaired, that was the man's livelihood. So you realize that what you have done has a greater impact than it would do in the West.
When we were in Pakistan and India, we went to any number of the sites that were more or less on the route. New Delhi, for example, and the Taj Mahal, of course. You can't go past them. It would be like going to London and not going and having a look at St Paul's or Trafalgar Square.
After the long haul across India, the Land Rovers had to cross the mile-wide River Ganges.
One of our sponsors was Brook Bond. Now, Brook Bond runs an empire, which is a sort of second division government. Every village throughout the continent has a Brook Bond man with a little stop-me-and-go-on cart. So if you actually want to do anything in India, or find out anything in India, or buy anything, or do whatever you want to do, you go not to the chief of police or the chief minister, but you go to the manager of Brook Bond. So we went to the manager of Brook Bond in Patna, who was almost weeping because he couldn't provide us with any elephants, because Bulganin and Khrushchev had just paid a state visit and taken all the elephants away. But he was desperate to do whatever we wanted. So he said we wanted a boat to cross the Ganges, and he said, dead easy, I'll get somebody to take you there in the morning. When we got to the banks of the Ganges, and they said, there's your boat, pointing at a little country boat with a bamboo deck, and said, that's it.
When we saw the boat, it was very small. The width of the boat was only about the same as the length of the car. The problem was to get the car onto the boat very, very, very slowly and gently, because if you went too far, or you disturbed the balance of the boat, which was flat-bottomed and I would think highly unstable, the whole thing might have tipped.
The whole thing was imminent disaster, but made good film, and away we went. Having got on the boat, the crew hoisted the sail, and they all cast off and lay down and went to sleep. And we drifted down the river until sunset. When we hit the far bank, about 7 hours later, the crew woke up, put another bamboo ramp down, and off we went.
The expedition headed north to Nepal to film Kathmandu for the BBC, whose viewers had never seen this part of the world before.
The legendary Kathmandu, which was an absolute must-go-to for filming purposes, but it's not been possible to get there in the past. At that time, everything had to be carried in over the mountains on people's backs, including the municipal steamroller and the British ambassador's Humber car.
The Nepalese, extraordinarily sort of stalwart, stocky, carrying these amazing loads, and one would see 12-year-old children carrying 50, 60 pounds.
Swinging on swings was the big recreation. Set up in the streets were enormously high bamboo sort of framed swings, 40 feet high, which passers-by just swung and people watched.
The team then drove via Calcutta to the Indian region of Darjeeling, famous for its tea plantations.
One of the problems that we sometimes had, a small problem, was where did we stay the night? And we were in Darjeeling, and we were wondering this when we saw a likely-looking tea planter. So we cozied up to him, and he suggested we stay the night with he and his wife in their home on the tea plantation, a little way out of Darjeeling. To get there, we had to cross a bridge, and the bridge was made, it said on the notice, maximum load 10 loaded ponies. We calculated that the weight of a Land Rover was about the same as, perhaps slightly less than 10 loaded ponies. What we hadn't really worked out was that the ponies would have been going in single file, so that the weight at any one point would not have been very significant.
And I drove alone, and the bridge went down and down in the middle, and it was an extremely frightening experience.
We could see the weight of the Land Rover as it moved across the suspension. It actually, from being a curved suspension, it became an angle, with the Land Rover making the angle as it inched slowly across. One of the problems was the driver didn't know whether to do it at speed to get across before the bridge broke, or to do it slowly, easily, gently, to give the bridge every chance.
But the biggest challenge still lay ahead. In order to complete the next leg of the journey, the expedition would have to cross into Burma.
We knew very little of Burma. I mean, we knew about it from newsreels of the Burma campaign in the war, but we had no idea what the Burma landscape was like. What was it? Was it jungle? Was it paddy fields? How were the people dressed? What did they do?
This is where the uncertainty began. We were certain of our abilities so far, and there'd been no physical, even political difficulties. But from now on, anything might happen. We've no idea what the difficulties and dangers would be.
Since the end of the war, there had been several attempts to cross Burma, but none had succeeded.
The most significant reason was the difficulty of crossing from India into Burma. There were no roads before the war. However, during the war, there was at least one road built, the Lido Road, sometimes known as the Stilwell Road, because General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, an American, was the boss, basically so that he could get supplies into northern Burma to fight the Japanese, and also, more significantly perhaps, to get supplies into southern China, that he could reinforce Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalists who were fighting the Japanese. This was the most expensive road ever built. Probably still is. It cost millions of dollars a mile through this very, very difficult country. But in 1945, at the end of the war, there was no economic raison d'etre for that road, and so it was totally abandoned. And by the time we got to it, you see, which was 10 years later, it had gone back to the jungle. One could just see in places the trace, and we were able to follow the trace. It was the Rubicon. If we could succeed, we'd crack the first great problem geographically of getting to Singapore.
We, of course, chose the right time of year. It was January. It was the waters were at their lowest. So the technique, we would walk across the river first of all to see how deep it was and to move any big boulders out of the way.
Tim often did that. I don't know why. Perhaps his trousers rolled up more readily than the rest of us.
As far as wildlife was concerned, there are snakes, of course, in Burma, and some quite deadly ones, but I don't know that they go swimming.
Before you went in, you would disconnect the fan belt, because otherwise the fan would throw water up onto the electrics.
The second step was to only send one vehicle in at a time, so that the first one went in and gurgle. It could be pulled back by the one still on the bank and dried out and try again.
Burma had seen some of the bloodiest fighting between Allied and Japanese forces during the war. Debris from the conflict littered the country.
We came across a Japanese two-man tank, which we all played about in. It was just a shell. Everything had gone from it.
Burma had gained independence in 1948, but fighting between rival ethnic groups now made travel through the country highly dangerous.
The different tribes in Burma, of which there are 7 or 8, all decided they wanted a hand in the government. They were extremely upset, and they've been in insurrection ever since. They operated the opium trade, so they would attack anything perceived to be military or police. They also like to attack civilians for their gold rings or whatever was to be had by pinching. There was every chance that we would be ambushed, and since the road was very steep and with a lot of jungle around, and the road just about wide enough for our cars, one couldn't have escaped. The threat was indeed real, because other convoys, the army lorries, which were the civilian buses, all had several bullet holes in the windscreen and had been attacked in the past.
It was straightforward until we got to the Salween River, which separates what you could call sort of the major part of Burma from an eastern salient, the Shan State. And in that area we knew that there was a certain amount of trouble, and the Burmese army had told us that there was a certain amount of trouble. How far the Burmese army were responsible for the trouble is another story. So when we got to the Salween River, we found an escort waiting for us. 2 very clapped out jeeps, which broke down rather promptly about half an hour into this escort. We repaired it for them, and then Henry, our mechanic, drove it because he'd repaired it and he felt that he'd drive it. And you have to remember that 3 or 4 of us had done our national service, so we knew a bit about weapons and weaponry.
We didn't like the way they carried their weapons, and at one stage I think Tim and or Nigel sort of took over the weapons from them.
So we rather took over the escort and found ourselves not only escorting the escort, but also repairing their 2 jeeps.
With some relief, the expedition crossed the Thai border and arrived in Bangkok. From Bangkok, the final leg of the journey took them down the Malay Peninsula to Singapore. Since 1948, Britain had been fighting a jungle war against communist guerrillas, but the team saw little evidence of the Malayan emergency.
Going down Malaya, the roads were excellent. It was the first time we'd really been on really excellent roads, almost since Western Europe. And certainly crossing the causeway was a significant moment. And we knew it because we had it made, another hour and we'd be into downtown Singapore and finished. We'd run out of road, so to speak. We'd achieved what we set out to do so many months before. As we came across the causeway, we engaged in a little bit of stupid dueling to see which car would be first across.
I do remember one thing, however, which did rather upset me, and that is the Oxford car overtook us.
On the 6th of March 1956, the 2 vehicles arrived safely in Singapore to a grand welcoming party.
Fantastic reception with champagne and the press, the absolute lot. I think somebody said to us that we'd arrived half an hour late. To which we said that we didn't think that half an hour was too bad in 6 months, and we weren't running a bus service.
Difficult to express feelings after 7 months and 16,700 miles on the road. But the notion of champagne and things like that was, we didn't like champagne much. I think we'd rather have beer, and there was some beer. But the real thing we wanted was our letters from home and the feeling that we could send letters home saying we made it.
The film shot by the team was assembled by David Attenborough and shown in black and white on the BBC later that year.
We got a marvellous audience for the series. I've forgotten what it was in terms of millions. But it was a very successful series, and you got the image that all over England, people were sitting in front of their television sets, this little, small, black and white flickering image, and saying, wow! You know.
The successful completion of the expedition soon took on a greater resonance. A rapidly changing world made much of the route both physically and politically impossible.
It's been done very seldom since, and in fact since about 3 years after we did it, nobody's done it, and you couldn't begin to do it today. I mean, think of the political problems of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Baluchistan, so that means the Middle East out. The road from India into Burma, the Lido Road, that's completely gone. The only part of the journey which would be much easier is from southern Thailand into Malaya, where now I gather there's a superhighway with tourist buses going backwards and forwards.
When one finishes an achievement, you have a feeling of both of relief and elation, and a certain feeling of anticlimax, looking ahead. This will never be the same again. I will never do this again. What can I do? I've got the rest of my life ahead of me. How am I going to make it equally exciting? Do I want to go to the office from 9 to 5 and dream of the past, this great adventure, or am I going to be able to achieve something which will keep me interested for the rest of my life?